The New Orleans Saints can start their rebuild this offseason with 5 major moves, and the 5th move is the most important move they can make to get this team back into position to compete for Super Bowls in the future. After a disappointing injury-plagued 5-12 2024 season, missing the playoffs for the 4th straight year, the Saints are in desperate need of a rebuild based on the state of their current roster. Most of their best players are aging and expensive, and Saints GM Mickey Loomis's propensity to kick salary down the road to try and sign their own guys to compete has caused them to have little to no flexibility in free agency and a salary cap bill that has now come due. And with a roster clearly not ready to compete for a championship, moves have to be made to set themselves up for the future. This is going to be a very difficult task, but I chose to do this video for a reason. I love a good challenge, and that is certainly the Saints offseason situation as of now. With that being said, the first move to rebuild the Saints and set them up for the future is doing whatever you have to do to get your cap back to zero, get your cap space back to even. I didn't fully understand the depth and gravity to the Saints cap situation until doing my research for this video. This situation is awful, and it's been building for years now. I learned a lot about how the salary cap truly works because of this video, so shout out to Mickey Loomis for being yourself and doing all of this craziness with the cap. Also, shout out to overthecap.com because they did a great in-depth article about the Saints situation. And here it is, as simple as I can put it. According to Spot Track, the Saints are last in the NFL in cap space, currently $38.8 million over the cap, and that's after already making moves and cuts to get them down to that number. But there's no significant outright cuts that can help them get their number back down to even, because the last 5 years they've been trying to restructure and add void years to their veteran players' contracts to help maintain their roster, which they've done. They've kept their roster intact, and it helped their cap situation in those previous years. But if you're helping yourself with restructures and to add void years for the cap this year, it doesn't mean that money just goes away. It means you're going to have to pay that money down the road at some point. Most teams who are contending for titles choose to do this to maximize their window. We're seeing it with the Eagles as we speak, but the Saints haven't won anything, and now all those restructures and void years are coming due on their current salary. So for the Saints, it's imperative that they find ways to get this year's salary cap number back to even, because if they don't, they're subject to a $5 million fine and a potential loss of draft compensation. Those are things the Saints literally can't afford to lose, literally money-wise, they can't afford that. And because of the age of their roster, they're currently the 4th oldest roster in football. With where the Saints are at, they kind of got a hope in terms of their cap for a couple of their vets to retire, and Ryan Ramczyk, who looks like he will be retiring, and Cam Jordan as well, but it looks like Cam wants to keep playing. Both of them retiring would save the Saints a lot of money on this year's cap while limiting more of the dead cap as well. Also, Tyrann Mathieu and Demario Davis could be cap casualties as well, because they are veteran players who still want to play and can play at a high level, but probably don't want to play for a rebuilding Saints team anymore and might want to go to a contender. Those guys aren't going to save the Saints much on the cap for this year, but moving on from them could be beneficial for future years. Other guys like Carl Granderson, Eric McCoy, and Cesar Ruiz could be restructured as well, but the fewer contracts they can restructure, the better if they want to expedite this rebuild, because they don't want to keep screwing their cap in future years with dead money and void years. But for the Saints to even out their cap situation, it also requires this move, and it's the second move for the Saints to rebuild and set themselves up for future years. You're going to have to restructure Derek Carr and bench him. Before I learned of the true gravity of the cap situation of the Saints, I had planned to just say trade or cut Derek Carr. Unfortunately, it's not that simple. First of all, despite Carr having the 7th best pass grade in the NFL per PFF in 2024, nobody is going to be interested in trading for him, because we all know what Carr is at this point. He's a middle-of-the-pack quarterback who's been good at times, but at 33 years old, we know what he is, and unless he's on a super talented team, which the Saints don't have right now, you are not winning a Super Bowl with Derek Carr at quarterback. With the roster they should want to start over with, getting younger and moving off some vets, especially Carr, is the main way to start your potential rebuild. However, now that the Saints have waited this long, and after the 2024 season, it basically forces them to keep him unless someone decides to trade for him. And because this situation is so complicated, the main way they could have moved on was by doing the following. Again, shout out to overthecap.com for an awesome breakdown of this whole situation. An outright cut of Carr has never really been an option because it doesn't really help this year's cap situation. $50 million in dead money if Carr is cut. The Saints would have had to renegotiate Carr's contract, so they could have designated him as a post-June 1st release, where they could have given him a guaranteed bonus but reduced his salary for the 2025 season, but they decided not to do that last year. So now you have to restructure Carr's deal this year, which is the biggest on your cap, just to get under this year's cap. I guess cap-wise, that all kind of makes sense, right? But why would you bench him if you have him? Wouldn't it just make sense if you're paying him all this money just to play him? The Saints front office will probably see it that way, but I see it the exact opposite. Which leads me to my third move the Saints need to make this offseason to start their rebuild, and that's by starting Spencer Rattler at quarterback. Now, if you look at the numbers and you look at PFF's passing grades, which had, like I mentioned before, Carr the 7th best quarterback in football and Rattler as literally the worst graded quarterback in football, this wouldn't make much sense. But considering the Saints situation and what's best for the franchise's future, this is the only only real decision for them to make. Rattler will be 25 at the start of next season, and despite the awful numbers last year, he's got talent. He was good with his legs last year, and he has all the arm talent of a quarterback that could become elite someday. Rattler was also very negatively affected by all the Saints injuries last year. The Saints were second in the NFL last year in points missed due to injury. Only the Lions had more. Most of those injuries made Rattler's life a living hell. No Olave or Shaheed at wide receiver. The offensive line was very banged up, and even Taysom Hill was banged up for a lot of the year. So I think giving Rattler an opportunity with a new offensive-minded head coach in Kellen Moore is the only rational decision to make for the Saints' future. Plus, maybe it pisses off Derek Carr, who then changes his mind on a pay cut, wanting to change teams and play elsewhere. And Carr could be an asset to a playoff caliber team who has a quarterback go down at some point next year to injury. Then the Saints might be able to trade him and get some sort of salary relief as well. If you think about it, there's no real reason to start Derek Carr next year if you're the Saints. It should be Spencer Rattler. However, I think the Saints are stubborn enough that they'll still go with Derek Carr. With that, let's go to our fourth move of the offseason that helps the Saints speed up their rebuild for the future, and that's by signing 0 free agents. And when I say 0, it's not literally 0 because you have to fill out your roster, but 0 free agents to multi-year deals and 0 free agents to contracts more than $5 million. If you're the Saints, you need to keep the spending as light as possible this year so you don't go over this year's cap, and as light as possible on next year's cap as well, so you give yourself a chance to reset the cap as soon as possible. That should be the main goal of the Saints offseason this year. Reset this cap situation this year as best you can to help out this year and future years. If you got to bite the bullet on certain players this year, do it. But we can't have this situation linger for longer than it already has. Again, you got to credit GM Mickey Loomis and the front office for having the balls to go in and sacrifice the future to try and win. Most organizations won't do that. Unfortunately for the Saints, you didn't win at all, and that sucks, but it's time to reset. So no big money deals, no multi-year deals, and help set yourselves up for the next opportunity to make a run. But before I get to my fifth move, if you like these type of videos, do me a huge favor and subscribe to the channel. Us here at Between the Uprights have a ton more content coming your way, especially for this offseason. We've got drafts, free agency, predictions, hot takes, whatever you want, as long as it's related to the NFL, we got it. So if you want more of this, subscribe and we got you. With that being said, my fifth and final move for the Saints to set themselves up for the future and start their rebuild is related to the draft. So with their 2025 draft, they should trade down and accumulate 2026 draft picks. First of all, trading down and putting more picks into next year's draft, again, helps the situation cap-wise slightly for this year. You won't have the more larger end rookie contracts. I also think the Saints holding the 9th overall pick is a good spot to trade down from, because if a player that was supposed to go earlier slides, I think a team behind them is going to trade up to 9 to get who they want due to not having to give up nearly as much draft compensation. My plan looks like this for the Saints, and I think this is their best course of action to start their rebuild as far as their draft goes. First of all, you're going to trade down to the mid or late first round. If you want to trade all the way out of the first round as well, I'm cool with that too. But I think somewhere in the 18 to 30 range in the first round is good. See if you can acquire somebody's first next year, definitely somebody's second next year. And wherever you trade back to, build the line of scrimmage. I think that's the first place to start a rebuild. Offensive line is a need for them with Ramczyk retiring, and with how banged up and bad they were last year, they can address it again in this year's draft. They were last in the NFL in pass protection last year, 51.7 grade per PFF. And the Saints have spent first on their tackles the past few years. Fuaga at left tackle last year, Penning at right tackle a few years back. Now, neither is what you want so far, but you have to continue to invest in the line if you have a chance in the future. I like someone at Kelvin Banks in that 18 to 30 range to maybe kick Penning inside, or someone like Gray Zabel, who you can just start on the interior as well. Or you can then look at your line with Fuaga in year 2, Eric McCoy, who's been a really good center in the league when healthy, Cesar Ruiz, who's been good on the interior as well. Hope for something more from Trevor Penning, and whoever you draft in the first round. I think that's a good plan for this year to help protect Rattler and for the future as well. Having an O-line you can build around is such a big plus for any NFL team. For the Saints, I think you can trade down even with your second and third round picks as well to help accumulate even more 2026 picks, and I'd like that strategy if I'm the Saints. Now, my favorite mock for the Saints' future that I traded down from 9 to 18 with the Seattle Seahawks. The Saints got 18 and their first round pick in 2026, where the Seahawks picked Ted McMillan because he slid in the draft and Seattle had already traded DK Metcalf, and I got Kelvin Banks at 18th overall for the Saints. So I again traded the Saints out of the second round this year. I got the Packers second next year and their third this year, plus more 2026 picks. I picked some D-line later in the draft, which is especially deep this year, and that helps a defense that graded really poorly per PFF PFF last year for the Saints in these categories. They had the third worst overall defensive grade, second worst run defense grade, the fourth worst tackling grade, and the 10th worst pass rush grade. I also then picked Savion Williams to help at wide receiver in the third round and Gunnar Helm to help at tight end in the fourth round. So for the Saints, you're doing a balancing act of helping make your team younger, but still giving your quarterback and Rattler some younger weapons to work with and fortifying an offensive line that was banged up and struggled last year. These moves won't make the Saints a playoff contender next year, but they also shouldn't want to be playoff contenders next year because they have zero chance of turning themselves into a Super Bowl caliber team in 2026. And two, if they did make the playoffs, maybe Mickey Loomis uses that as an excuse to keep spending more and keep kicking the can down the salary cap road. With this plan, we've helped ourselves get off some money for this year and next year, gotten way younger this year and next year, and acquired more draft assets for next year, where hopefully we can have a young core to build around during the 2026 draft and maybe even free agency. And if you're New Orleans, with the way your cap and roster situation is, I think that's a home run of an offseason.